I'd like to start this event by acknowledging the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, on whose lands Riding New South Wales is situated. I pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on right now, the Djajawarrung, Tangarong and Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, as the traditional owners of the lands of the Macedon Ranges region. I'm down here for the inaugural Mountain Riders Festival in Macedon this weekend. So both Miles and I are doing a little jet setting at the moment. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands where you are joining us from today. Feel free to make your own acknowledgement of country in the chat box if you would like to do that. And now I'm delighted to introduce today's guest, Miles Merrill. Miles Merrill is the creative director of Word Travels, a not-for-profit arts organisation that creates literary and literacy programs for festivals, private companies, libraries, schools and cultural institutions around the Asia Pacific, with a focus on developing performing writers. Originally from Chicago, birthplace of slams, Miles is a writer, performer, facilitator and event coordinator who combines poetry with theatre, experimental audio, hip-hop beats, stand-up and occasionally political confrontation. Miles introduced Poetry Slam to Australia, co-wrote and co-directed Slamming for the Sydney Festival and performed with UK DJ Billy Bizniz at the Sydney Opera House. Internationally, Merrill has performed in Krakow's Audio Art Festival and Writers' Festivals in Bali, Beijing, Vancouver and Calgary. Welcome, Miles. If you're there, it's lovely to have you join us today, and thank you so much for fitting us in between all your jet setting. I understand that you're overseas in between your duties at the moment. Do you want to start by telling us where you are right now?
Yeah, I'm in Denpasar Airport, having just finished up at the Ubud Writers Festival in Bali, and heading to the Singapore Writers Festival for their opening talk this evening.
Amazing. And how was the Ubud Writers Festival?
It was really beautiful. The conversations were really intense. I was chairing a panel called Combating Racism Through Creative Practice. And yeah, there was a lot of hoops and hollers and a lot of excitement in the room. Sammy Shah was on the panel. He got up and did some stand-up comedy. So, you know, you wouldn't think that you'd see stand-up comedy in a panel on combating racism, but there it was, right?
And what about your duties at the Sydney Writers Festival? What have you got ahead of you? Singapore Writers Festival.
Singapore Writers Festival is going to be interesting. There's quite a bit of performing. There's a couple of panel discussions. I think a lot of it for me is actually just making further connections, because as part of my job at Word Travels, we organize for the Australian Poetry Slam champion to tour to writers' festivals around the world. So I really just want to try and make as many, I guess, new contacts and try and organize a larger, I guess, international connection for Word Travels.
That's amazing. I'm just sitting here watching you walk through the airport and thinking about how appropriate it is that Word Travels is the organization when you're here at First Friday, literally traveling as we speak. I think that's a first for First Friday. So,
well, the time
cool.
Just a little bit strange. I really thought that I'd have I thought I had everything worked out. You know, the flight doesn't leave until 3 p.m. Sydney time. But then everybody was like, no, be there 3 hours ahead of time. I went, oh, okay, here I am.
Well, that's travel in 2022, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you for doing this. And if you do need to pause at any moment to check in your bags or talk to airport staff, just let me know and I'll hold on my next question, okay?
Well, we're going to be standing in this queue.
Oh.
For quite a while. So this might be the entire talk right here.
Okay.
I think that queue is probably going to be our entire interview.
All right, sounds good. I'm happy to entertain you while you're in the line then.
12:05. 12:05. Economy or business? 12:05. Business. Business. Yeah. Really? Yes. Oh no, traveling for business, not in business class. What is your check-in? 12:05. Economy. Yeah. This entry, yeah. Okay. Okay. No battery inside. No batteries. Cigarette lighter. No. Okay. Hello. Sorry about that.
That's okay. We're all living vicariously through you with your international travel. So Miles, your website is incredible. I loved reading through all the highlights of what you've done over your career, from coordinating poetry slams across states and countries, performing at countless writers' festivals, facilitating Indigenous mentoring, radio hosting, to guest lecturing in poetry and graphic design at university. I mean, I could spend this entire hour reading your CV out loud to everyone. Could you take us back to the very beginning of your career in the arts? When did you first fall in love with words?
Well, I was really high school, but there was kind of a defining moment for me where I thought that I would be an actor, and I went for an audition in a play called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and the director stopped me after just a couple of lines in the audition and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm reading the script." And he said, "Oh, but you're reading for the lead character?" And I said, "Yeah, what's wrong with that?" And he said, "Well, the lead character is not Black." And I said, "Well, it doesn't actually say that in the script." And he said, "It's implied. The man's name is Murphy. He has to be Irish." I said, "How does that explain Eddie?" He went, "What? What's Eddie?" I said, "Eddie Murphy." And he went, "Well, we've got you listed as janitor 1, janitor 2, or the Indian guy whose name is Chief, and he's comatose through most of the play." And that's when I realized anything going on in my head, heart, gut would never actually be shared if I waited for someone to cast me in the perfect role. So I switched my major at university to English literature. And I found that there was quite a bit of homogeny there as well. That I got a response back from an agent saying, "Would you consider changing your main character?" Very few readers who are white women over 50 will actually empathize with a central character that's a 19-year-old African-American security guard. This was a conversation with an agent. I just went, okay. So for me, the ability to stand in front of a group of people with my writing became almost essential because, I think those were a couple of challenging moments, and I don't think that represents the entire theater or literary industry. But I think just the ability to have immediate access to my audience without filters, and the person who publishes a book has the publisher, the editor, the designer, the marketing person, the publicist, the truck that takes their book to the shop, the bookshelves, the whole apparatus. But if you perform your writing, you're basically a solo creator and somewhat entrepreneurial, because you've got to create gigs for yourself and get up in front of an audience. But I feel like the result of direct human to human communication with an audience is really rewarding. And I think people who publish books only really get that when they go on tour with their books, that actual communication with their audience.
And do you remember when you first came across spoken word poetry?
Yeah, I had been in a band when I was in Chicago. And when I came to Sydney, I was in a relationship with a theater director, and we were out at a night called Brackets and Jam. And the MC for the night got up and said, "Okay, we've got about 20 minutes while the next band sets up. Does anybody want to say anything? Anybody want to do anything?" And my partner was like, "Why don't you get up on the stage and just do a poem?" And so I got up and did that. And someone came up to me afterward and just said, "Can I give you $50 to do that at my cafe on Monday?" I was like, "Oh, okay." And so that worked. I mean, I had been going to the Poetry Slam in Chicago originally, but I hadn't been really getting up and participating. I was really on the path of being in a punk band. And then in Sydney, no musicians, a notebook full of lyrics and words. It just seemed like the easiest thing to do, to get up and just start sharing things directly. So, yeah.
So you're the founder of the National Performing Writers Program, Australian Poetry Slam, and you're well known for introducing slam in Australia. So take us back to how that all came about and how we as Australians felt about it at the time. Were they cynical, critical of the movement, or was it just embraced immediately?
Well, I think there's a couple of stages to it. So I ended up, after the performing my Cafe on Monday gig, going to the Sandringham Hotel in Newtown and being offered an opportunity to perform there every Monday with few other artists. There was a guy called Tug Dumley, another one named Phil Norton, and another named Benito DeFonso. And so the four of us had the stage every Monday night. And after about 4 weeks, we were sitting around having a drink after the event, and we went, this is going to get exhausting. It's the same four guys entertaining the same audience every Monday night. And then someone said, why don't we do an open mic? And I said, oh, there's heaps of open mics around. How are we going to do this differently? And then there was another guy who was like, we should make it a competition. And I said, oh, what about a poetry slam? And there was Phil Norton's also from Chicago. And he said, that would be amazing. Why don't we do that? And so we just started doing it. And the prize was $20. Second prize, bottle of wine. Third prize, anything we found on the street on the way to the venue. So that kind of went for a while. And then what happened? Oh, I did there was a poets union. So imagine the poets have a union. Yes, there's a poets union, and they were running the Australian Poetry Festival with a big finale of the Leichhardt Performance Poetry Competition at Balmain Town Hall. They wanted to have 500 people, and they asked me to host it. I went in for the meeting, and they said, we have 50 people, all performing for 5 minutes each. And I went, that's way too long. Like the last person is just going to have no audience. And they said, well, what would you suggest? I said, well, why don't you contact every poetry night in Sydney, Newcastle, Blue Mountains, Wollongong, and ask them all to host a round and only send the top 2 from their rounds. And the first response was, we can't afford to pay all those judges. And I said, what about the audience? So, well, the audience isn't qualified to judge. I went, well, but it's a show though. So we ended up, presenting this thing that was the Leichhardt Poetry Slam with a $5 prize and heats all over the city. And someone from Sydney Festival saw it and said, Miles, can you produce a poetry slam show for Sydney Festival? And then from that, State Library of New South Wales, someone from there saw the Sydney Festival show and said, can you do a poetry slam for State Library? And they said it was the biggest thing that they'd ever done other than having Nick Cave in the reading room.
Wow.
And then from that, I said, well, there's a library in every town in Australia. We really have a venue, a person to do publicity and marketing. If we can figure out a budget, we can hire a poet in every state and territory that's like me. They can host a poetry slam, run a workshop, and we can make it a national thing. So we did New South Wales, 2006, and 2007, every state library in the country hired a poet to go and run heats and workshops and host state finals. And the first national final was won by a guy who's now a family law barrister in Melbourne, Mark Testar. Yeah. And then the second one was, not only was it won by Omar Musa, but it was in partnership with ABC, broadcast live on every local radio station in the country and online, recorded and rebroadcast for ABC television. So it kind of, continued to grow from that. And it wasn't until 2010 when the State Library of New South Wales got a new events manager. And this guy said 3 weeks before the first event was about to have bums on seats, said, we've looked at the budget for the poetry slam and we're going to cancel everything. And we're going to start focusing on books of poetry. We've realized that for the price of one poetry slam event, we could do 5 poetry book launches a year. And so I basically freaked out. I contacted every other organizer in the country, and the State Library of Queensland said, well, we have already spent $60,000 on our program for the year, so we're having the Queensland Poetry Slam. And several other states were like that. Few said, sorry, we can't do it if the State Library of New South Wales isn't going to pay for it. But I just contacted a friend who was a lawyer and said, I've looked at this grant application thing, and it looks like I have to become something called an incorporated association in order to receive funding. And she said, okay, that's pretty simple. I'm a lawyer. I can be your chairperson if you want me to be. You can't be the chair because you're kind of the person running it. Be the vice chair. And that one friend I met at the Poetry Slam who helps out as a volunteer, she seems pretty organized. She could be your treasurer and secretary at the same time. And I'll put the paperwork in today. And so within 2 weeks, we had our first board meeting, became an incorporated association, took everything from the state libraries, set up Word Travels, applied for funding, and got $85,000 in our first year to run the Poetry Slam. So, yeah.
What an incredible journey. So obviously there's been a shift and change in perspective over the years as well.
Yeah.
And why are you so passionate about Poetry Slam specifically? What do you think they contribute to the world of arts and culture?
Well, at the end of most poetry slams, I say the audience has been tricked. They've come to a poetry reading and they have cheered, they've given standing ovations, they've hollered, they've whistled, they've clapped. But what they're clapping for is this artifice, this competition thrown over the top of a poetry reading where they get to watch their heroes rise and fall. It's a very classic story. By the way, this is the Australian Poetry Slam champion over here. Just done an interview here. This is Huda.
Hi.
Hello. She's a little bit further back in the queue, actually. She's going to be like, let me jump ahead with you. So I think it's that the competitive aspect brings the audience. How are you going to get 500 people to pay $60 each at Sydney Opera House to come to a poetry reading unless you've got, I don't know, Paul Kelly, Tim Minchin, and several other celebrities. But, we're talking about people from, the current Australian Poetry Slam champion who won just last Sunday, the 23rd of October, is a woman named Joanna Yang from Tennant Creek, right? The teacher, high school teacher. The woman you just saw on the screen, Huda, Sudanese refugee from Brisbane. So we've got audiences basically showing up for people they've never heard of to celebrate their work, which is really exciting.
It is exciting. And what can an audience expect when they go to a slam event? I've heard all about the clicking, and I know you have a pretty creative way of choosing the judges for competitions. So could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, we've got a couple of different ways. So the drama theater at the Opera House is a little bit too big. But what we usually do is throw 5 things into the audience. They can be fluffy toys. When we first started, we used to throw condoms into the audience. But one person almost got hit in the eye with a condom, which made me call my public liability insurance and just say, what happens if you're, say, at a poetry reading and someone, say, gets hit in the eye with a condom? And the person on the other line was like, is it in the wrapper? Okay, yeah, well, we throw them into the audience, but we now, we still use chocolates, but at the Opera House now, what we do is we collect 5 poems and we stick them to the underside of the seats. So this most recent national final we had poems by people who are currently in detention, in refugee detention centers. And the people who found those poems, we give them a radio mic, a cordless mic, and they stand up and read out the poems of people who are in detention. And those 5 people become the judges for the night. So it puts a different metaphorical spin on the term judge, really.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And so something that I know a lot of people wonder, especially if they've never been to one of these events, is what makes a slam poem a slam poem?
Well, here's the secret: is there's no such thing as a slam poem. A poetry slam is a competition. So, you have a band slam where people compete with their bands and it's a competitive event. But at the end of it, you don't say the band is a slam band.
True.
So, same sort of thing. I mean, people at a poetry slam perform monologues and stories and poems and sometimes just sound poetry, which can just be like, right? So if you were to have something that was very genre specific with very specific hooks that you would say you have to hit this note here and it has to be in this type of meter, and you saw 16 of those in a row, you'd get a little bit exhausted. So what happens at a poetry slam is the ultimate expression of individuality, hopefully, if it's encouraged. You know, there are a lot of slams that I've been to in the States where you could kind of say it was hip hop without the beats.
Okay. I like
But
that. Yeah.
yeah, but I think it's more theater combined with literature.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit more about Word Travels, the nonprofit organization where you're the creative director? What kind of services do Word Travels offer to the community, and how can people get involved?
Well, I mean, obviously we run the big National Poetry Slam, but we also have a program called Story Week. So Story Week does panels and workshops and like teachers' professional development and training. But a lot of what we do is we go to schools and regional and remote communities and work with refugee communities, work with First Nations communities, finding people who've never thought about standing up in front of an audience with their own writing before. And the model is we do a performance with some of our best artists. Then following from the performance, we sign people up to a workshop so that, you know, if you show up to a country town and you say, hey, come to the poetry workshop, you're probably going to get 3 people. But if you have a show where you go, this is what spoken word poetry can look like, you could end up with 150 people at the show and 20 people signing up for the workshop. And so from the workshop, then you say, great, fantastic. Do you want to give it a go on Saturday? We'll have a little poetry slam at your local library. And so the audience member becomes the artist over a 1-week period or a few day period. And they then from that poetry slam, the community chooses 2 people to represent Kempsey or Coffs Harbour or Albury or Wodonga. And then those people continue on to perform in Sydney or Victoria or whatever state or territory they're in. And then through that process, you end up with some really amazing artists at the final. And then you hire those artists to go back into the community and do the performance the following year and create the whole cycle of building the artists from our local communities. So there's that. The other thing that we've done a lot more of recently is hire our beneficiaries. So realizing that not everybody is just going to perform poetry for a living. In fact, most people aren't. We have hired some of the people who've participated in our poetry slams as creative producers. So Hani Abdile is one of our staff now, and she works on staff doing creative production for new migrant programming. So she was someone who spent a year on Christmas Island. The first thing she did when she came out of Christmas Island was do a workshop with Word Travels. And then we've helped her to publish her book, tour, make a living as an artist. So yeah, the next stage for us is leadership. So instead of just building an opportunity for someone to do a gig, we want to create opportunities for artists to become idea makers and idea presenters and idea producers, so that, you know, it's not me coming up with the ideas and hiring you to do a gig. It's actually us inviting you in, giving you a budget and saying, what are your ideas? Here's a venue, here's a marketing budget. Let's create something together. And for me, that's much more powerful because you're getting the authenticity of that person's perspective, rather than me saying, here's a festival where I put you into a panel called Combating Racism. By the way, there were all, of course, 4 Black people on the panel, Combating Racism, which, you know, I guess we're the only ones who experience it. So yeah, which if you're actually getting people, so we've got a creative producer for First Nations programming as well, who things come from her perspective. She wants to create the programming that she feels works for her and her community. And I think that's, for me, a greater investment in our arts community than just saying, here's $300 or $500, come and do a talk.
Yeah, it sounds like a really beautiful way of organically growing diverse communities in the way that Word Travels moves around, and then the leadership opportunities that come from that.
Yeah, I think so, because I think, you know, we can have all this call out for diversity from our funding bodies and major arts organizations, but I feel like if there's still, you know, I went to a talk with Tony Burke and it was all about the new cultural policy and how to develop it, and he wanted lots of feedback. And I went to this session, and I was one of two brown people in like the 200 people who were there. But everything about what Tony Burke was saying is we need diversity. We need representation from our, from our diverse communities. It needs to be, BIPOC communities. It needs to be LGBTQ. But I just thought those are the beneficiaries you're talking about.
Yeah.
Beneficiaries also be leaders. Like the leaders are here in the room, and they're basically heads of funding bodies, but they're not actually, and they're the decision makers in the end, but they're not actually representative of anything you're talking about. Kind of preach to the people who are going to go and tell the brown people what to do, or get their feedback and program their festivals based around diversity. But I just felt incongruous to me.
Absolutely. I will encourage you all to go onto the Word Travels website and have a look at the page Our Impact, because there are some incredible stats on that page about how Word Travels is having that amazing effect on communities, and the percentage of young, Indigenous, culturally diverse, LGBTQIA+ people who have been involved in these workshops is wonderful. And we've just posted it in the chat there. On the Word Travels website, Miles, it also says, we believe that spoken word artists, poets, hip hop artists, storytellers, and monologists can develop an industry equal to that of actors, musicians, and writers. Our main objective is to inspire people to tell their stories in creative ways, primarily through live performance. So could you talk to us a bit more about what that means to you and how we can work towards developing more equal creative industries across the arts?
Yes, well, I think, as I was saying before, the author of the book has this little kernel of creativity. And from there, it goes to the editor, the publisher, the printer, and all of these other roles have a financial stake in this kernel of knowledge. And they, so the artist only gets 10%, right? And then the other 90% gets divided up by all of these other people. So I think for performing writers, we're trying to figure out who are these support roles, right? Who are the people who can begin to make their own living from the work of the performing writer? Similarly, with musicians and actors, there's obviously massive support where, yes, you've got the actor, you've got the writer, but then the 10,000 people who work on Star Wars, So we haven't quite figured out what that is yet, but I feel like Word Travels is kind of trying to create a model for it. So having a marketing staff member, having people on our team, we've got 7 staff who work on our various programs, and the people that we hire are performing writers. So I think, I don't know, I feel like it's the equivalent of having a small publishing house, really. And I'm hoping that can begin to happen a bit more for writers who perform. I mean, when you think about it, I'd say more than 80% of the creative writing that we consume is not actually in novels. It's a podcast, it's a movie, it's a TV show. It's it's looking at the world around you. The majority of creative writing is actually spoken. And so many people think, oh, this is a contemporary thing. But if you have a look at what was happening with the Dionysus Festival in Athens in ancient Greece, you had lottery tickets sent to people's houses, and they showed up to a stadium, and those with lottery tickets became the judges, and they were judging the poetry and the storytelling and the theater of the day. Now, Sophocles won his competition 23 times. Aeschylus was in second place and Euripides in third. Now, those are really the only 3 Greek writers that we recognize as, the best there ever was. I mean, there's thousands of them that actually performed, but those 3 are the ones that we know the best. And the reason is the prize at that time was not money and wealth. It was a laurel wreath on your head, but everyone for miles around memorized your work and shared it around fires, around tables. And so the longevity made it all the way to writing. Now, obviously, we can also say that there is a massive literary canon in Australia that predates settlement, that isn't written. It's songs, it's stories, it's dance, and it's in many cases ephemeral or it's private. And so if we can understand that that is a massive part of our literary canon, that writing makes, creative writing makes up only a tiny percentage of what's actually there and shared, then we need to look at new ways for academia, I suppose, to acknowledge that. I was on a panel where there was an academic, who said, well, performance and performing poetry, it's ephemera. If it's ephemera, there's no document. If there's no document, it can't be studied. It doesn't exist in an academic sense. I was like, oh, okay, what about theater, dance, music? And he said, well, if you can film it and record it, we can study the document. So you're telling me that someone who studies theater has never gone to a live show? So, I think we just need to expand what we think of as creative writing.
Right. That actually leads me into a personal question about your creative practice itself, which we were definitely curious about here in the office. Do you write down your spoken word performances?
It's a mixture. So sometimes I start with writing things down. When I write them down, I write in notes. So, I will stomp my feet here. I will howl here. I will clap my hands here. I will whisper here. So, you very rarely look at a poem and see BPM up at the top. What speed will this be in? Right?
Yeah.
But there's speed, there's volume, there's movement, there's all kinds of things that I add to the performance, and it becomes a script. But the other thing that I do is I go to the notes app on my phone, and instead of using the letters and numbers on the little keyboard in the bottom right, there's a microphone. I tap that and I start speaking and the words start writing. And so it's one of the easiest ways to transcribe spoken text is to just start speaking it into your phone these days, and you've got a first draft. And so, I mean, but the craft for me is in the editing.
Yeah.
I think anyone can stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
Anyone can just sit and write for hours and hours until they get a cramp in their hand. Some people it's 15 minutes before they get a cramp, but it's the deciding what to keep and what to throw away. It's deciding on the imagery and the metaphor. And I liken it to, you go to the riverside and you dig out a massive pile of clay, as much as you can carry, and you stick it on the plinth. Now, you don't just walk away from that and say, that's my sculpture, right? You actually get out the scalpel and you get out the sculpting tools, and you work on it and you craft it and you tear away all the bits and pieces until you have the perfect bust of Scott Morrison, right? But and I think it's the same thing with writing. You've got your raw clay that you just vomit onto the page, and you can do that for hours. But at the end of the day, you've got to go back and just take out this, that, there, and but. Look for anything that ends in ly and ask, why isn't it a verb?
Yeah. And then do you rehearse your spoken word performances a lot, or is it like the rehearsal is part of the editing? The editing is part of the rehearsal?
Yeah, I think there's one of the steps is to speak it out loud to see what it sounds like and see how it feels. And I even do this as I'm writing fiction, because I'm working on a novel. And when you write dialogue, I think it's so important to speak it out loud, to understand if it actually sounds like something someone would say. Dialogue can sound really, really contrived and really written. If you want it to sound a bit more human, you have to actually speak it out loud. And I also think, poetry, if it's got meter and rhythm and assonance and alliteration, those are all aspects of sound. So if you aren't speaking it out loud, how do you really know what how it's being received? So yeah, I think the rehearsal for me is really important. A lot of people I see get up on stage with a piece of paper, their phone, their iPad, but I challenge you to go and see a play. And at what point have you seen an actor pull out a script in the middle of the play and start reading from the script? Or go and see a band where the lead singer pulls out the lyrics and just starts reading the lyrics from a piece of paper.
Yeah.
Right? It's a work of art you're creating. And you have to kind of respect your audience, put the time in and go, okay. I mean, the unfortunate thing is most people aren't getting paid. So
Yes.
they don't invest in the show because they think, oh, the audience hasn't invested in me. They've gotten in for free or they've paid $5. So they're not giving it the value that they should be, because society isn't giving it that value either.
Yeah.
But if someone's paying $70 to see your STC show at the Ross Packer, you would memorize your work,
Yeah.
And so I think it's the same thing for writers, is you start by creating a great show, and then eventually I think you do get paid.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions before I throw out to the audience, but just a reminder to everyone here today, if you have questions for Miles, please post them in the chat box and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So Miles, you've just had Story Week finish up for another year. We've got next year to look forward to. Can you tell us a bit about what goes into the planning of these sort of big events, and how do you figure out what to curate? And can you give us any hints about what we could maybe look forward to next year?
Yeah. So the planning is often starts with a debrief on the current program. So we'll sit with the team, collate all of the feedback from our artists, our audience, and collate all the feedback from our staff and board, and have a strategic planning day at the end of November. So usually a month after Story Week. And once we've done that, then we calculate all the grants that we've applied for and have received and are yet to arrive. And then the next step is to start thinking about venues, partnerships, branding, doing call outs for expressions of interest, that sort of thing. And I think what we're looking forward to a lot next year is I think we want to start going down the path of, can we get a Tim Minchin or a Paul Kelly on stage? Can we? Because, I mean, Tim Minchin's got one of the largest number of views on any Australian poem. It's an animation about a dinner gone wrong, and it's got millions and millions of views. So if he doesn't think of himself as a poet, it'd be really weird if he didn't think of himself that way. So, and I've got a couple of friends, Brendan Cowell, knows Tim, and hoping to kind of just pull some strings, really. Really gone down the celebrity path before, but I'd like to give it a try. And then we'll do a program called Chasing Home, which is our refugee program. We'll do another one called First Person Voice, which is our First Nations program. We're looking at a documentary series called If My Home Was a Poem. So, and that's all about being on the road with poetry. I think it's going to be exciting. There's a lot of just admin, basically, that goes in.
Absolutely. Yeah, it sounds like it. But it sounds like we have a lot to look forward to, for sure. You've done a lot of partnerships and collaborations over the years. Do you have any memorable ones or favorite ones that you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, there was one that was kind of interesting. I was asked to one of our poets was asked to stand in the OPSM eyewear store for Mother's Day at World Square and write Mother's Day cards for a couple of hours while they filmed him. And then they created an ad for OPSM out of that. And one of the people that Phil, our poet, wrote a card for was a construction worker still in his high-vis gear. And as he started talking about his mom, he just burst into tears. And he was like, the most, classic masculine, I'm just a, construction worker man. And it was just this really beautiful moment. And I think the thing I liked about that was they originally contacted us and said, we want to hire talent and we can pay the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance and equity rates for an actor. And I said, yes, but this actor is writing all day long, giving away copyright for all of his work. And you are asking us to put forward someone whose title is the Australian Poetry Slam champion, and you want to trade on that. So each of those things has an additional cost. So it went from, we can offer $400 to $7,500 because I just went, well, it's a collaboration. We're working with you. We want to share this on our social media, and we'll even give you our logo, but you need to pay for the writing, you need to pay for copyright, and you need to pay for the branding. And so that was kind of my first experience with that, economy of scale when it comes to commercial projects. Since then, we've done stuff with T2, the tea shop, and we've done all kinds of things, really. We've done a collaboration recently with the Art Gallery of New South Wales called Poet Taster, where we had people sitting down in the members lounge, and the members lounge was open to everybody. And on the table was a jar full of words. And they would take out if you sat down at the table and picked out a word, one of our poets in a Word Travels t-shirt would come over, sit down and say, oh, I noticed you've chosen the word regurgitate. That's from one of my poems. Can I sit down and share it with you? And so we had 5 poets all sitting down at people's dinner tables and their glasses of wine, all sharing poems for an hour and a half.
That's very cool. It sounds like from a lot of what you've been saying today that and I've read this on your website as well, that what you're really doing with a lot of this stuff is challenging genres and pushing boundaries and breaking down that wall between the artist and the audience a lot of the time, getting them involved. And it sounds like some of these collaborations are key to that as well, which is very cool.
Well, I think a lot of it is breaking down the notion of a venue as well. A collaboration under lockdown where we got tired of Zoom events, and we basically replaced Mary Gilmore and Banjo Patterson on the $10 note with Jazz Money and Samuel Wagan Watson. So you were able to point your camera phone at the $10 note, and the $10 note is a trigger to turn your camera into a video performance. So Mary Gilmore, space disappears, and Jazz Money appears. So you're replacing someone who, Mary Gilmore was a staunch advocate for the White Australia policy. She, believed in supporting First Nations people as part of the flora and fauna of the country. So I'm just checking in here. So I might pause and see if you want to gather some questions.
That's okay. Thank you. We'll pause for a second. There are some incredible questions coming through. Thank you, everyone, for getting involved in the chat box as well. And I can see Judy has said, sorry, I have to leave early, but this has been great. So thank you to Miles and to everyone for being here. I can also see Annie has talked about a poetry performance in Petersham Bowling Club on a Thursday night where we recite our work. That sounds really cool. And if anybody else has any experiences of poetry slams in Australia, in Sydney, wherever it is that you're based, pop that in the chat as well. I'm sure Miles would love to see where everyone is getting involved in spoken word performance. It would be really great to hear about some of those events from you all in the audience as well. While Miles is checking in for his flight. And if you do have more questions, please do pop them in the chat. We've got about 10 minutes left of the session, and we're collecting some really great questions for Miles when he's ready again. And we can all just pretend that we're also checking in for an international flight and heading off to Singapore Writers Festival as well. while we're waiting, does anyone have any Poetry Slam stories they'd like to tell us about in the chat? Please do pop them in there. Was anyone else at the finals of the slam recently? It was at Sydney Opera House. One of our colleagues, Julia, was in the audience and said it was pretty incredible. And Miles was just telling us before that they sold around 500 tickets, which is just fantastic to think about. The humble beginnings that he came from, performing in the pub, the cafe, to the Opera House with 500 people. We've got some really great questions from the audience. Thank you all so much. I hope that we can get Miles back soon to answer them for you. There he is.
Okay.
Thanks, Miles.
Go to gate 4, but yes.
Okay, while you're heading to gate 4, we've had some audience questions come through. So Annie has said, I go to Petersham Bowling Club on a Thursday night and we recite our work. My friend also wants to start a poetry slam. How would these two types of events be different, and how would a person go about starting an event like this?
Well, I mean, a poetry slam is you choose judges from the audience on the night, and they judge the poets. A poetry reading is you book 1 or 2 feature artists for your event, and then you could do 3 feature artists, and then you generally have an open section where a few people will get up, and you would time limit that to say 3 minutes or 5 minutes for people to get up and recite their work. And I find that the audience levels vary quite a bit. And they can rely on the feature, or they can rely on the host of the poetry slam. They can also just rely on whether or not you've done heaps of marketing and publicity for your work. And it is one of the things that I encourage, is that people do spend time actually promoting their are you still getting me here?
Yep, we've got you.
Yeah. Okay, cool. My screen looks frozen on my side.
Oh, well, no, we've got you.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay. Passport. Hold on one second. Picture down. Picture down. There you go. Yep. Boarding pass as well. Okay, boarding pass. Oh, boarding pass. Okay, great. All right. Boarding pass. Emerald. Boarding pass. Go there. Yep. Boarding pass. There you go. And boarding pass. There you go. Okay. Take your mask off, or just the boarding pass? Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right. Yeah. So I think make sure that the venue also promotes what your program is.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my advice. I don't know if that's enough, but
that's a fantastic jumping off point.
And try to differentiate poetry slam versus poetry reading.
Perfect. Thank you. Nathan has asked, how would you describe the relationship between poetry and prose?
Well, I think great prose will still have. Oh, hold on one second. Oh, okay. Yeah, here you go. Yep. Just leave it there. Okay, come on through. Okay. I think great prose will still cut out unnecessary words, use imagery, use metaphor. I think that the thing about prose is that it's a longer sustain. I mean, you can say Ernest Hemingway's mini fiction, what was it? For sale, baby shoes never worn. I mean, that is a poem and fiction at the same time. I don't think there's a massive difference between the two. But I do think that when you start to look at stylistic forms, that have been established in poetry, you know, whether it's a sonnet, whether you're using iambic pentameter, whether you're doing a rondeau. Those are very specific formats that you can say this is obviously a kind of, or it's lyric or it's ballad. So if you're using those particular definitions, then there's a clear difference between the two. But I think if you're using free verse, then it's virtually indistinguishable, other than the fact that the poem is often going to be shorter, unless, of course, you've got a verse novel. You know? And I know people often forget that Shakespeare is performance poetry.
Catherine has asked, there's a heap of work to do racism in the arts world. Do you see change happening?
Yeah, I do. And I think it comes from putting diverse people into positions of power, you know, even like on boards and as CEOs and as decision makers. That has to happen. And, you know, even on the board of Word Travels, I said to a previous chair, I said, there's no point in us having a diversity, you know, a push to have diversity on the board if there's still one white person telling everybody what to do. So that diversity has to be also listening and supporting people's different ways of communicating. You can't just say, well, that person was shy, so they never spoke up, so they never got heard. You actually have to say, we'd really like to hear from you and your perspective. Right? You can't just kind of leave it open and say, well, it wasn't minuted. They didn't get involved in the discussion. And so therefore they can't contact me later and say, hey, I was never a part of that decision. I think that we have to make sure that we're facilitating discussions. I think the other thing is that the traditional forms of, I will advertise on ethical jobs, Pro Bono Australia and Arts Hub to recruit, doesn't work for diversity. You actually have to tap people and approach them, have coffees, have conversations. It's got to be much more of a, you know, I really love what you do. Let's have a conversation. Because, you know, the channels that we're advertising and recruiting through are pretty homogenous.
Yeah. Kira has asked, what advice would you give for aspiring writers looking to get into spoken word and slam poetry?
Well, just write and go to an event. Like there's lots around. Yeah, there are lots around. You know, we run regular poetry slams. Bankstown runs poetry slams. Obviously, Peter Shimbolo. There's also the West Side Poetry Slam. There's Poetica in Bondi. And maybe a slam isn't the first thing that you go to, because it's a competition. And if you don't score well, you might feel, oh, wait a minute, something's wrong with my work. But remember, the point is not the points. The point is the poetry. That's the mantra of poetry slams, that we're getting audiences cheering your writing. So yeah, I think, write something, or even speak it into your phone, record it, memorize it, and go and share it in front of a group of people. I mean, that could be a campfire as well. It doesn't need to be an event.
Yeah, well, that actually leads well into my final question from Rowena. Do you have any advice for nervous public speakers who want to do spoken word? Is it just a matter of putting yourself in the uncomfortable situation and practicing?
Yes, I think it's also, it's a few things. So one is, I mean, I do have a book called Slam Your Poetry, Write a Revolution, which you can learn about this stuff from. But I mean, one is do it first with people you feel comfortable with, rehearse. And second is know your first, say, 30 seconds of work so well that when you come out, your fear translates as excitement rather than nervousness. You know, fear is adrenaline, and you can use that adrenaline to replicate power on stage rather than fear.
That's great advice. Yeah. My colleague is putting some links in the chat to local poetry events that you can all check out. And Miles, I just want to finish with a comment from Catherine, who said, "This is fantastic. It's great theatre watching you negotiate the airport while giving your audience your experience and wisdom." And I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much, Miles, for being here and for taking us through the airport. That was really a journey. It was very, very fun. We
Well,
will finish up now to let you get on with your travel experience. And everyone's starting to post in the chat to say thanks as well. It was wonderful. Everyone, that is our last First Friday of the year. We will see you all in the new year for many more First Fridays starting in March. Our first season of courses in 2023 will be live on our website at the end of this month. So keep an eye on our socials and e-newsletter for the announcement. Thank you, Miles, for everything in the last hour. And thank you so much to everyone for being here and joining us. We hope to see you at another Writing New South Wales event soon.